Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome everybody to the last in this three-part series of Regulatory Insights webinars. This one is titled, Turning Your Attention to the Debt Capital Market. My name is Rick Irving, and once again, I'll be co-hosting this webinar with Monique Martinez and Jordan Toy from Merchant Tech Capital, as well as Nikita Hunter from Akora. We're also excited to be joined today by Valdine Reddy. She's Director of Capital Markets at the JSE, and she's our guest speaker today. In terms of the agenda this morning, Val is going to take us through the JSE's vision for the future of the debt capital market. Monique and Jordan will then have a look at the latest proposed amendments to the debt listings requirements with a specific focus on Section 6 and what directors need to know about continuing obligations. And Nikita Hunter is then going to close us out with a presentation on focused insights on governance for debt issuers before we do a brief Q&A with the remaining time. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have any questions, please drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom of the screen as we go, and we'll then address those at the end. Please also specify who the question is addressed to, and if we don't get to your question in the allocated time, we're happy to pop you an email and engage further. That's it for the introduction and the housekeeping. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Val to share her screen and take us through her presentation.
Good morning, everybody. It is really an honor to be here on behalf of the JSE, and I do look forward to walking through this presentation with you. Great. Can you see my screen? I'm hoping so. So from the JSE's perspective, overarching, we've had three strategic priorities bucketed in three categories. One being a trusted marketplace, two, trying to serve on the national agenda, and three, really working with the ecosystem in our effort for co-creation for growth. All of this has also underpinned what we would like to do from a strategic perspective in the debt markets. And really in the debt market, some of the principles that we've looked at is to build a trusted marketplace in terms of supporting and increasing trade activity, supporting the national agenda, and this has become more so a priority in the light of the current environment that we've had in the debt space, and then also working with the ecosystem along the value chain to really create products and strategic deliverables that are of high demand and use case scenarios for the market. Okay, what we have done through this year is worked on 3 or 4 initiatives that we think that will really add some meaning and depth in the debt capital markets. So the 2 new additions that we've had this year is to launch a sustainability segment, and that is almost approved at the moment, at the current point in time at the moment, where we have under the sustainable segment, we will be introducing sustainable bonds, social bonds, as well as our existing green bonds, which will currently fall under a sustainable segment at the JSE. In addition, there's been a lot of demand and interest in the infrastructure space specifically, and this has really been a catalyst for what is meaningful to stimulate economic recovery. And so we do have an existing product which we launched in 2018, which was project bonds, which was largely to facilitate flows in the infrastructure space. We've not had any take-up yet, but this is a mechanism that might prove more worthwhile in the current environment as we get higher demand in the infrastructure and project financing space. Just to highlight and elaborate a little bit more on each of these instruments. So the green bond has really been one where we've had good success to date. There's been 11 instruments that have been issued and have raised and with a market cap of 7 billion in terms of market cap, and with 5 issuers have come to the market in terms of issuances in these instruments. This has been very topical globally, has had large AUM that has seen follow it and track it, and really there's many eligible green projects that these have proved funding mechanisms for. The key feature of the green bond is the use of proceeds, and really each of these can be channeled towards one of these eligible green projects that we've highlighted. Areas of renewable energy, sustainable water management, efficiency and energy efficient and co-efficient products, pollution prevention, sustainable management, especially in climate change adaptation, and then clean transportation. So these have really been of particular interest to our investor base, and really the green outcomes sit high front and center in terms of the flows that have been channeled towards ESG and ESG related products. So we have seen that this has been extrapolated even in light of COVID, where there's been more conscientious investing, that this has been not only in the South African landscape, but even globally, money and demand has tracked these products. Just to go on, so the project bonds, as I highlighted, these really are a standalone, for standalone specific projects. They get repaid from the project's cash generation, and the performance is linked to the project risk. It has been a little bit tricky in that with construction projects, they typically have different life cycles in terms of their risk profiles. But where we stand at the moment is that these could particularly be used in refinancing in the second phase of projects, where you see an uptick from a financial risk perspective and how this could be more broadly applied to investors. We are also working very closely with the ecosystem to see how can this be edited, or are there new mechanisms, given infrastructure is such a high priority, both from a government level as well as in terms of what would be a catalyst for economic recovery in South Africa. So this would be an ongoing trajectory that we would be looking at from the JSE of how these can be edited or adapted so that the use case of the product becomes relevant. As I mentioned earlier, we are in almost ready to launch a sustainability segment, and to the green bonds we will be adding social bonds and sustainability bonds. These are also going to be a type of bond where the use of proceeds will be exclusively applied to financing or refinancing of eligible social activity. And we have purposely not overly prescribed these so that they are broad-based use cases, very much aligned with what could be supported from the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we have already seen decent uptick in these locally and internationally. So these have really come in the timeliest response to the market need at the moment. Just to highlight some of the trajectory that has been seen globally in the social and sustainable bonds, really good traction. And there's been 29 bonds that have been listed since the start of the crisis. $60 billion has been raised globally in 29 COVID issuances. And with a social and sustainability lens, these are preferred instruments, especially in line of the crisis at the moment. So the social impact bond is ongoing. This is going to be the first in the listed space that we are trying to promulgate. There is many that are being done in the unlisted space, but this is really a social income bond that would have an outcome-based model where you would have to choose outcome-based initiatives and then have this really have meaningful impact to be measured as one of the key deliveries in the framework. This is still something that we are working on with the marketplace, and hopefully would be able to come to market to the later part of this year or sometime early next year. And globally, the stats around this has been quite resounding. Just to highlight the South African bond market, notwithstanding the Moody's downgrade, where we saw catalysts of outflows, particularly in March, we've still seen decent activity in both the issuance as well as the trade activity in the bond space. And really, on a real return basis, part of this has been from the forms of that South Africa still has good yield appeal, although we've had cyclical periods where there's been very volatile activity. Just to highlight the new bond instruments, 2019 was a very good year for us across the debt space. This year we're tracking a little bit lighter than 2018 and 2019, but still see decent interest as an asset class in the debt space. So we're seeing continued growth in the debt structured products and warrants market in South Africa, as well as the ETF, less so in the equities market, but in the equities market, the appetite has more been on secondary capital and additional capital raise. And just to put this as a collective, as we mentioned, 2019 was quite an outstanding year. And in 2020, while we've been derailed somewhat in terms of COVID-related activity, we have seen a big interest and a continued interest in momentum to start. Thank you.
Thanks, Val. If you can just turn off your video there, and we'll then hand over to Monique.
Yeah.
Thanks, Val, and good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many participants in today's webinar. And if we consider that there were 710 new bonds issued on the JSE during 2019, with a total sum of 284 billion, it's not surprising that the South African listed debt market remains a significant and continuous source of funding for companies seeking to raise debt capital on the market. And obviously, this number does not include the undisclosed amounts raised in the unlisted environment via bilateral and mezzanine agreements. Notwithstanding the global pandemic that we're all dealing with, debt listings have continued on the JSE, and as at May 2020, around 47 billion has been raised, with 7 months of the year still remaining. As mentioned, I will be unpacking version 5 of the proposed amendments to the debt listings requirements, which were published by the FSCA on 27th March for public comment. And together with my colleague Jordan Toy, we will be focusing specifically on Section 6 of the proposed amendments. Section 6 will be the new home, so to speak, of continuing obligations, which, as you know, are currently contained in Section 7 of the existing requirements. Given the time that we have available today, we will not be focusing on any of the existing continuing obligations, which include the likes of price-sensitive information, events of default and credit ratings, and instead we'll just talk to the proposed new amendments. However, given the current global pandemic, issuers should be especially mindful of their obligations to timelessly disclose price-sensitive information relating directly or indirectly to the financial or trading position of the issuer or the issuer's debt securities in accordance with the requirements. Just as a note before I get into the content of my presentation, you will see that I've included the annotations to the relevant paragraph of the proposed amendment in the smaller blue bubble on each slide, so that if you wish to revisit any particular proposed amendment after our webinar, you know exactly where to find it. Alternatively, don't hesitate to reach out to us after the session. I will kick off the Section 6 amendments with covenants. The amendments state that once the listing of a debt security is granted, issuers must ensure that where the placing document or pricing supplement contains any financial covenant clauses, this information is then calculated as specified in either such placing document or pricing supplement and released on SENS in accordance with the specified measures and notification timelines. The amendments stipulate that where there are no notification timelines specified, issuers must release the covenant information on SENS within 60 days after the required measurement period. Where the placing document or pricing supplement does not require disclosure in terms of measurement or compliance, issuers must release a SENS announcement within 2 business days after the required measurement period, confirming that the covenant measurement has in fact been performed, together with a covenant level achieved. In mirroring the approach followed in the equity requirements, confidentiality provisions have been included in the proposed amendments. This has been done to ensure that debt issuers are clear that information that is required to be announced in terms of the requirements, including price-sensitive information, cannot be disclosed to any third party during JSE trading hours, which are obviously between 9 and 5 weekdays, until such time as it has been published on SENS, or outside of JSE trading hours until such time as arrangements have been made for the information to be published on SENS before the start of trade on the next business day. Debt issuers that deem it necessary to provide such information prior to releasing it on SENS must ensure that in doing so they do not commit an offence in terms of the FMA, and in particular Section 78(4), which states, amongst other things, that an insider who knows that he has inside information and who discloses the inside information to another person commits an offence. Where issuers have elected to provide the information prior to releasing it on SENS, become aware that the necessary degree of confidentiality thereof cannot be maintained, or if they suspect that confidentiality has or may have been breached, must immediately inform the JSE and ensure that such information is announced accordingly. If an issuer intends to release any information at any meeting or forum, arrangements must be made for such information to be published simultaneously on SENS. If any such information is disclosed in an unplanned manner during the course of a meeting or forum, the issuer must immediately inform the JSE and ensure that such information is announced accordingly. The appointment, resignation, removal, retirement, death of directors, the company secretary and the debt officer, as well as changes to any important functions, executive responsibilities of the directors of an issuer, including changes of board committees, must now be announced on SENS, and this must be done by no later than close of business on the business day following the decision or receipt of notice detailing the change. The SENS announcement must state the effective date of the change and include the reasons therefor. Some of you who attended our Regulatory Insights briefing earlier this year may recall that an earlier version of the proposed amendments called for debt issuers to appoint an investor representative, which then became the compliance officer in a subsequent version of the proposed amendments. And now version 5, as was the case in version 4, talks instead to the mandatory appointment of a debt officer for certain categories of debt issuers. In terms of paragraph 7.3g of the proposed amendments, the debt officer must be either the issuer's financial director, group treasurer, or a senior employee with full delegated authority from either the financial director or the group treasurer, whose competence, qualifications, and experience must be considered by the board, who must be satisfied therewith upon the appointment. The amendments state that the responsibilities of the debt officer are to act as a central contact person for the issuer to assist holders of debt securities with any issues pertaining to compliance with the terms and conditions of the relevant debt documents and the debt listings requirements, and also to assist holders of debt securities with access to the register through the transfer agent. In terms of the proposed amendment, a debt issuer will be required to call a meeting where it receives a demand by holders of debt securities holding not less than 10% of the value of a specific class of debt securities, or not less than 10% of the value of all outstanding debt securities. In this event, the debt issuer is required to immediately inform the JSE in writing and to release a SENS announcement stating that it has received a demand to call a meeting and specifying the date and time of such meeting. Now, in terms of paragraph 675 of the proposed amendments, the issuer must issue a notice of meeting within 5 business days from the date of receipt of the request to call the meeting. The date of the meeting should take place within 7 business days from when the notice is issued. Additionally, the notice must allow for a pre-meeting of holders of debt securities to take place at the same venue and at least 2 hours before the scheduled meeting of holders of debt securities occurs and at which the issuer is not present. And lastly, within 48 hours of the meeting of holders of debt securities, an announcement setting out the outcomes of the meeting must be published on SENS. Finally, before handing over to Jordan, I'd like to point out that as set out in paragraphs 676 and 677, voting at the meeting must take place by way of a poll and not on a show of hands. and the chairperson of the meeting will be elected as voted by the holders of debt securities. The holders of debt securities who demanded the meeting may, prior to the meeting, withdraw the demand by notice in writing to the issuer. And if, as a result of one or more of the demands being withdrawn and the required percentages to call a meeting failing to be met, the issuer may then cancel the meeting. That concludes my presentation, and so I'll now hand over to Jordan.
Thank you, Monique, and good morning, everyone. My name is Jordan Toy, and the topics that I'll be covering in respect of the amendments includes restatements, repurchases, and dealings, which all form part of Section 6, continuing obligations of the debt listings requirements. Firstly, I'll be briefly talking about restatements. Now, this applies to any previously published results that have been restated, and in this situation, the debt issuer is required to submit a restatement notification to the JSE containing details of and the reasons for the restatement. Moving on to the repurchase of debt securities, a debt issuer is not permitted to repurchase any debt securities during any period where it is in possession of price-sensitive information that has not been published. Note that the exceptions to this rule are if the repurchase is an automatic repurchase in respect of a credit-linked note resulting from a credit event being called, or if it is a repurchase pursuant to the exercise of an early redemption right by a holder of those debt securities. It is also worth mentioning that the repurchase of debt securities that I've just explained does not include market-making activities where the issuer provides liquidity or serves as an intermediary to facilitate transactions. Now, in respect of the offer to repurchase, the JSE must be notified of the issuer's decision to proceed with the offer, which must be open for at least 15 business days, and that while the offer is being considered, no dealings in those securities are to be carried out by the issuer, members of its group, associates, or subsidiaries until the offer has been submitted to the JSE or abandoned. Now, where an issuer intends to make an offer to repurchase debt securities, it must release its announcements on SENS in accordance with the JSE timetable. If you don't have this timetable on file, feel free to drop a message in the Q&A and we will ensure that we send it to you. An announcement containing the details of the repurchase must be made on SENS when an aggregate of 10% of the initial nominal value of the debt securities has been purchased during a financial year, and for each subsequent 10% in aggregate of the initial nominal value during the remainder of the financial year. This announcement should be made as soon as possible and should contain the following details: the highest and lowest price paid, the number of securities purchased since the most recent announcement, the nominal value of the class of debt securities that remain outstanding, and whether these securities will be cancelled, and if so, when this will occur. Finally, I'll be talking to the amendments in respect of dealings in securities. This section applies to any dealings, whether they be held beneficially, directly, or indirectly by a director or company secretary of the issuer, and any associate of a director or company secretary. Note that for a more detailed explanation of associates, see the definition as contained in the debt listings requirements. So now that we know who dealings apply to, let's take a look at what types of transactions are considered to be dealings. Dealings include any sale, purchase, or subscription, and any agreement to sell, purchase, or subscribe for the securities of the issuer. The acceptance, acquisition, disposal, or exercise of any option to acquire or dispose of the issuer's securities, and any other transaction that provides direct or indirect exposure to the issuer's securities. It is also important to mention that directors are obligated to notify the issuer of any dealings within 3 business days, and the issuer must announce the dealings on SENS within 1 business day of receiving this notification. Note that the clearance to deal must be obtained from the chairman in advance of the transaction, and this clearance cannot be provided during a closed period or during a period where price-sensitive information exists, irrespective of whether or not the director has knowledge of that information. A written record of clearance requested and provided must be maintained by the issuer. Now, in the case of dealings by an associate of a director or an investment manager, a director is required to advise any associates and investment managers of the issuers of which he or she is a director. Directors are further required to advise all of their associates in writing that the associate must notify the director immediately of any dealings in the issuer's securities. The director must also advise his or her investment managers that no transactions in the issuer's securities may be conducted without the director's consent in writing. In closing, it is important to note that everything I have mentioned in respect of dealings thus far does not override the provisions of the Financial Markets Act. Thank you. That concludes my presentation, and I will now hand over to Nikita.
Thank you, Jordan. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Nikita, and I'm from Acorum. Acorum is the company secretarial and corporate governance advisory division of Merchantech, and today I'll be taking you through some focused insights on governance for debt issuers. A key attraction of the JSE globally has long been that South African companies tend to have far superior governance than those in most other emerging markets. Unfortunately, the actions of a few bad apples over the past year or so have tarnished that reputation, and this has encouraged high levels of shareholder visibility and activism. Increased shareholder activism has resulted in numerous subtle changes to the South African corporate governance landscape over the past few years. As you will have seen in the media, global local investors are increasingly targeting environment, society, and governance investing. Section 7 of the debt listings requirements is a specific standalone section which elevates the importance of governance. It further addresses the specific corporate governance provisions applicable for different categories of debt securities or issuers in Appendix 1 to Section 7, which I'll share with you at the end of this presentation. Section 7 amendments are applicable to the following areas. Firstly, the King Code application is required to be disclosed in the placing document and annual financial statements. However, this can be incorporated by reference. It requires mandatory appointments of an audit committee and mandatory responsibilities of the audit committee, which I'll go into more detail shortly. It requires a current policy dealing with the evaluation of the board, its committees, its chair, and individual directors pursuant to the provisions of the King Code. It also requires some other policies, which I will touch on shortly. And it also requires mandatory appointment of a debt officer. So just in a little bit more detail, a brief CV of each director must be included in the annual financial statements. It should be further noted that a brief CV for each director standing for election or re-election at a general meeting or annual general meeting must accompany the notice of general meeting or annual general meeting. Then the capacity of each director must be categorized as executive, non-executive, or independent, using the guidelines to determine which category is most applicable to each director. In the case of independent directors, you should determine this on a holistic basis and on a substance over form basis in accordance with the indicators provided in the Companies Act and the King Code. All issuers must also appoint have an executive financial director. The JSE may, at its discretion, when requested to do so by the issuer, and due to the existence of special circumstances, allow for the financial director to be employed on a part-time basis or not at all. And this request must be accompanied by a detailed motivation by the issuer and the audit committee. In the event that the request is granted by the JSE, the issuer must announce the appointment of the part-time director through SENS. The issuer is not required to appoint a financial director if its holding company, of which the issuer is a wholly owned subsidiary as defined by the Companies Act, has a financial director and irrevocably and unconditionally guarantees the obligations of the issuer. The issuer also must appoint a debt officer, which person must either be the financial director, the group treasurer, or a senior employee of which full delegated authority has been provided from the FD or group treasurer. In the event of a full delegation of authority, the authority must in no way whatsoever diminish the responsibility vested on the financial director or group treasurer of the issuer. The board of directors must consider and satisfy itself on the competence, qualifications, and experience of the debt officer on appointment. All issuers must appoint an audit committee, and here the composition of the audit committee must comply with the Companies Act and should be considered in accordance with the recommended practices in the King Code on an apply and explain basis. provided that each committee must comprise of at least 3 members. A brief description of the audit committee mandate, the number of meetings held, and other relevant information must be disclosed in the annual financial statements. The issuer must confirm by reporting to holders of debt securities in its annual financial statements that the audit committee has executed on the responsibilities as set out on the slide. Then, as mentioned, all issuers must have a current policy on the evaluation of the performance of the board. The issuer must confirm this by reporting to holders of debt securities in its annual financial statements that the board of directors has executed this responsibility. All issuers must have current policies dealing with conflicts of interests of directors and executive management and how these can be identified and managed and avoided. Also, the process for nomination and appointment of directors must be included in a policy, which must also include details of the statutory framework for appointment of directors, if any, fit and proper assessment to be undertaken in order to evaluate candidate suitability, consideration of any conflicts, and the process involved when considering the nomination of domestic, prominent, influential persons as directors. Then, as mentioned, the appendix to Section 7 looks at provisions applicable for different categories of debt securities or issuers. You can therefore use this table as a reference in order to see which governance provisions are applicable to you. In conclusion, these governance practices are there to encourage the efficient use of resources with an aim to align the interests of individuals, the company, and society. Thank you. That's all from me this morning. We'll be now watching a short video before we move over to Q&A.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes the presentations for this morning. We've received a couple questions, so we're just going to address those now in the couple minutes that we have left. Remember, should you wish to have a one-on-one with the team, pop a comment to the panelists below, and we're happy to set up a virtual meeting with you guys. Okay, so the first question we've got is for Jordan. Jordan, what if my investment manager manages my portfolio on a discretionary basis and transacts in the debt issuer securities of which I am a director without my knowledge?
Thanks for that, Rick. So firstly, before I address that specific question, I think it's prudent to mention that all the references that I made in my presentation to investment managers excludes any investment manager of a pension fund pursuant to the Pension Funds Act. Now, to address your question, or rather the question, irrespective of whether your portfolio is managed on a discretionary or a non-discretionary basis, you are required to notify that manager that they may not transact in the issuer's securities without your express consent in writing. This is necessary to prevent a situation exactly like this from occurring.
Right. Okay, and then the last question we have is for Monique. Monique, when will the proposed amendments to the debt listings requirements be implemented or become effective?
Thanks. That's actually a great question and obviously very pertinent. Timing on the implementation or effective date is still unknown at this point in time, and it's likely that the FSCA and the JSE will still be engaging on certain of the proposed amendments. And so effectively, we'll have to stand by for further communications once there is clarity on this point. So it's a wait and see at this point in time.
Super. Thanks, Monique. Okay, everybody, that's all we have time for this morning. So thanks, everyone, for your attendance. And thank you so much once again to Val from the JSE for joining us. Look out for the follow-up email, including the links to the recording of the webinar as well as the presentations. So have a great day further, everybody. Bye for now.